Hello, welcome to Middle East Monitor Conversations Live. I'm Osman Butt, I'm a video producer with MEMO. Joining me today is Zahra Ali. She is a sociologist who specializes on questions around Iraq, gender, and issues around activism and so on. She's also written a book called Women and Gender in Iraq, which is based on field research that she's done. Zahra, welcome to Middle East Monitor Live.
Hello, Osman, and thank you for having me.
Good. So you visited, since 2019, we've seen there was an uprising in Iraq, particularly in Baghdad, where people gathered in Tahrir Square and these places to protest initially what was to do with the corruption and specifically the dismissal of a commander who'd served in Mosul, but that it's sort of based on his sectarian affiliations and so on. But then it mushroomed into a general protest movement against the elites in Iraq, the control-ruling elites. You visited these protest camps. Could you tell us a little bit about these protests, who's making them up, and why they're doing it? And
so since October 2019, Iraq really has experienced one of the biggest, I think, protest movement that I would call uprising, that in Iraq actually we call Thawra Tashrin, so the revolution of the October Revolution. So it's really one of the biggest protest movements of Iraq's contemporary history. I have to say it's not the first, and it's in many ways a continuation, or perhaps an exacerbation of series of protest movements that started to happen from 2011 in the context of the Arab uprisings. Then we had a really massive protest movement in 2015. In 2015, for example, it was mostly, if you look at, let's say, the protesters' profile, they were mostly educators, middle class, educated people, civil society, established civil society activists, and the emphasis was really on what we call al-muhasasa, which is the ethno-sectarian regime that was put in place by the US-led administration in 2003, which, for the first time in Iraq's history, established political affiliation, political belonging through ethnic, religious, and sectarian identities, right? And this has had, of course, a huge impact, along with the invasion itself, along with the basification and a lot of the politics in the way the invasion was managed. This has really reshaped the Iraqi political and societal sphere as well. And so for protesters at the time in 2015, there's a relationship between the fact that we have a state that has been destroyed, we have endemic institutional corruption, and this sectarian system that really provoked as well sectarian violence and institutionalized the rule of militias that are affiliated to the political parties in power. So interestingly, for example, in 2015, the slogan of the protest was Bismiddin Bagon al-Haramiyya, in the name of religion, we were robbed by looters. So it was really tackling, I think, the instrumentalization of religion as well by the Islamist political parties that came to power with the Americans in 2003, and the ways in which they were justifying, everything they were doing, the corruption, also the lack of managing of people's everyday needs, in the sense of, since 2003, there has been no attempt to address the very destruction of state institutions that, of course, started since the sanctions. And so Iraqis are living in a place where everything is really privatized, whether electricity, water, education, health. So everything is dysfunctional, and the corruption, the mix between basically corruption, nepotism, sectarianism, make the everyday life really, really challenging, and actually make the state a problem in people's everyday life. So that was 2015, and what happened is that this movement was really, I would say, appropriated by some political parties, including the Sadrist movement, that actually turned it into an electoral list, and this list candidated in the 2018 general elections. So, but protests never stopped. I mean, there's a sporadic, cyclical protest in Iraq, whether it's from students, whether it's from unions, whether it's from families in the neighborhood wanting to access electricity or water or proper housing, whether it's for unemployment. And so then we had another very, very important protest movement in El-Basra. And El-Basra is a very important province because actually most of the protest movement in Iraq started in El-Basra. El-Basra is where 90% of Iraq's oil resources are extracted. However, it's a province that lacks total infrastructures, where the employment is absolutely is the highest in the country, and where, I mean, the everyday needs of people, water, electricity, health, education, are absolutely not met. And where actually protesters are facing incredible violence from the Iraqi security forces, as well as from the militias affiliated to the Iraqi political regime. And so in 2018, we really witness, let's say, the exacerbation or the radicalization of the demands, because we moved from a demand from al-Madaniyya or a critique of the muhassasa system to kalla lil-ahzab, so no to political parties. So that was really a rejection of the system altogether. And I really think that, I mean, October 2019 would have been another wave of protests, like the others before. However, the massive presence of women, especially young women, I think really changed something and turned a wave of protest into a massive uprising that is a political uprising, but as well as a societal uprising, in the sense that if you look at actually the demands, but also at what the uprising did, right? It's really people, I mean, first of all, the ones who were at the center of the uprising were not lower or upper middle class, or let's say the educators or the educated middle class. They were mostly poor people. They were the people that we see that are already in the streets, that push the wooden cart, who sell cigarettes and all kinds of things in the streets, the tuk-tuk drivers, the people who rely on day-to-day income, right? Those people stayed at the center of the uprising. And of course, young people. I mean, most of the Iraqi population is actually young. And so young men and young women, and this time the slogan was much more, let's say, general in a sense. The slogan was "Nrid Watan," we want a country, as well as "Nazil akhud haqqi," I'm coming down to take my rights. And what happened was different in the sense that, so the space of Tahrir Square in Baghdad and big squares in Iraq's main cities, mostly in central and southern Iraq, so mostly in provinces that are predominantly Shia, actually. So you had people taking reclaiming or reappropriating public space, establishing their miniature society there, offering free services, opening bookstores, organizing theater plays. There was a cinema in Tahrir Square. Also, a society that is really meeting, right? Getting to know each other. I really think that what happened after October 25th was really, I mean, something of Iraqis starting to write their own history, starting to basically say, well, that we don't need this political elite, we don't need this dysfunctional political and sectarian political elite. If you leave us with ourselves, we're actually able to establish a very peaceful community of people, and so I think that in the squares of the protest, there was the negotiation of a new social contract. There is also something that is very interesting that I'm also analyzing is, in a way, I think that the October uprising also blurred the line of what is commonly considered as political. And in that sense, I mean that very often, of course, there were demands around the organization of new election, the appointment of a new prime minister, etc. So demands that are deemed political in the strict sense of the term political. However, there were demands, for example, the right to dress the way young people want, the demand to have curly hair, right? So you had the blurring of the lines of what the political is supposed to mean. And this is something that I analyze as also very emancipatory, in the sense that you have all types of demands that are in a way expressed in the same space and shared in the same space. And for me, the October uprising is also important, not only in what the demands were, but also in what it did, right? And what it did is actually produce an alternative space. Let's say that since 2003, the dominant political and social space in Iraq is privatized, it is militarized, and it is also very much patriarchal. And so in October 2019, the space that was produced by the protesters themselves was a space that was challenging militarization, the insistence of living in peace and refusing any forms of violence. It was also refusing privatization because it was really developing new state forms. There were free clinics, distribution of free food, everything was free. It was not a place where you buy things. It was really a place where you basically provide things for free and receive things for free, right? And it was also a space where I think that women had the possibility to negotiate, their presence, their physical presence, and how they want to be present. So it was a space that I would not say not patriarchal, but less patriarchal. And I think it really created a discursive space. This notion of Medaniya was really emphasized as a refusal of sectarianism, a refusal of violence, a demand to live in a society where we accept each other in our differences. And I think as well at the level of, the material space, that was also very, very important. For example, the reappropriation of what is public. The fact that if you look at all these squares, they were covered in arts and paintings. So really people are developing also something that I call in kind of my more recent research, there's a blossoming of life in all its forms, right? And I think in that sense, art is really central. And I think that really the uprising, because it was also met with so much violence. From the very first week of October, we had like over 150 protesters that were shot down by the Iraqi, shot dead, sorry, by the Iraqi security forces. And I think that actually this is what pushed people to come in October 25th. So in a way, it's also a challenge to the forces of death. And it is, the kind of analysis I'm also employing, I'm also comparing, in a way, the October uprising with La Commune de Paris. And during the uprising, actually, I was reading a French sociologist called Henri Lefebvre, who was describing La Commune de Paris as a big party, right? A big celebration. And I think that this element is very central in the October uprising, in a sense that I think that, of course, there are political demands, there are social demands, etc. But I think that in what it actually did, in the fact that it was a place where people were playing, dancing, and making art, right? It's also an uprising that, really developed a form of celebration of life, especially because it was facing incredible forces of death, right? And so it carried on for a period of over a year. And of course, COVID happens, but that doesn't mean, I really think that it changed, it was empowering for people. People felt really powerful, right? And it was, I think it has lived its mark in Iraq's social and, let's say, societal history in the long term. But now that doesn't mean, of course, that it necessarily reached its straight short-term political goals. And on the contrary, unfortunately, the figures of the uprising, many of them are currently in hiding. They are being harassed, threatened, or kidnapped by the militias that are affiliated with the Iraqi regime. And many of these militias are also Iran-backed militias. So the repression is continuing. But on the other hand, I think that the mobilization is also continuing as well. Despite COVID, despite everything, just in May, for example, there was a protest called Men qatalani, so who killed me, demanding justice and accountability for the protesters that were killed since October 2019, and more generally tackling, the repression, the very bloody repression that protesters and civil society activists are facing.
Yes, it's a very interesting time, because in some ways, though, you can think about the reappropriation of what is political to include things that we would regard as personal, but you could also think of that as a kind of parallel reflection of what's happened to the Iraqi state and the way that it has been personalized and privatized. Because one of the key issues in Iraq is, if you have, let's say, a ministry, you have no idea who that minister represents, but it's just his government. He's also affiliated to a militia. There's a guy next to him who's affiliated to a different militia. So there's a kind of privatization of politics that's already happened. And in some ways, this is a reflection of that kind of privatization of politics. And
that's a very good point indeed.
But what I would like to change pace a little bit, and because this is a very interesting point, that I'd like to talk a bit about feminism in Iraq. Surprising as it is to a lot of people, feminism does have a long history in the whole region, including in Iraq. And Iraq has always had a very interesting women's movement, which unfortunately doesn't get as much attention, even historically, when, for example, if you ever do history of feminism in the Arab world, which not many people outside do, you will likely focus on Egypt or somewhere like this. But Iraq itself has a very long history of female activism, feminism of different stripes, beginning in the 1930s, 40s, the shaping of the women's rights charters and these kinds of things up until 2003. So could you tell us a little bit about feminism in Iraq up until 2003?
Yes, well, I have a whole book on that, so I'm glad to talk about it. Yes,
I thought you were the right person to ask for that reason.
Yes, I've conducted in-depth field work within women's rights groups, and been working also with them since almost a decade now. And yes, thank you for pointing out the fact that Iraq has a very, very rich feminist history. And interestingly, in Iraq, especially if you compare to Egypt, which is such a well-known example for those who are aware of what's happening in the region, is that up to, let's say, the 1980s, the dominant trend of feminism in Iraq was a leftist and a communist, anti-imperialist trend, right? Because the dominant political culture in Iraq was, a very leftist and imperialist, anti-imperialist culture, dominated by the communist parties and other leftist groups, right? Until really the consolidation of the Ba'ath Party and its really incredible repression. So there has been also, of course, a nationalist trend, but for example, it's a revealing example that the revolutionary regime of 1958 actually appointed a woman, Naziha Delaimi, a very, very important and established women's rights activist and communist activist, as the Minister of Municipalities at the time, and she was the first women minister in the Arab world. And so I think that's, I mean, of course, under the Ba'ath regime, things were very limited because there was only one organization, the woman organization that was affiliated with the Ba'ath party that could actually exist. And most women activism was either underground or outside of the country. However, I mean, because of the economic situation, I would say that up to, let's say, the 90s, I mean, Iraqi women were the most educated women in the region. I mean, the health infrastructures, the education infrastructures were really the most performant in the region, right? So you have, I mean, accessible free healthcare. You have also massive, I mean, employment for both men and women were really working in all spheres. And also what we call the personal status code, which is the legal frame gathering most of women's legal rights. I mean, in the 60s, it was established in 1959, and it was the most progressive personal status code in the region at the time. Of course, I mean, if you follow, and this is also partly what I do in my book, is that if you follow the evolution of this personal status code, how it was actually reformed, right, in the 60s, in the 70s, and then in the 90s, you actually are following gender politics and also gender issues in relation to issues of nationhood, state, and religion, and how these things actually evolve in Iraq's history, right? And this is partly what I do in the book. And so I would say that, of course, in the 90s, I mean, because of the sanctions and because of the nature of the regime, the gender politics became much more conservative, and the personal status code was reformed as such. But it's really, I mean, it's really the sanctions that precipitated, I think, what we have experienced in terms of conservatism and social and religious conservatism. And of course, the invasion is a continuation, the US-led invasion and occupation is a continuation of that, and maybe an exacerbation as well of this phenomenon, because you have, of course, very conservative political forces, Islamist political forces that come to power. And so interestingly, and I talk about it a lot, is the very first civil society protest that was organized after the invasion in 2003 was a women's protest. And because one of the very first legal reform that was attempted by the political parties that came with the US invasion is to actually abolish the personal status code. So we really see how in this you know, war and invasion, I mean, on the one hand, of course, the American administration using a very neo-colonial discourse to go invade Iraq, etc., but also, let's say, the political elite itself, the discourse and the politics are so much gendered, right? Gender and sexuality is so central in defining what this supposed new Iraq should be. And so there's a colleague of mine called Maya Migdashi, who in the case of Lebanon, she has developed this notion of sectarianism. And in a way, I mean, I agree very much with her that actually many people talk about the Lebanization of Iraq, and I think this concept is very relevant for post-2003 Iraq, in the sense that it's not only a sectarian regime that was put in place in 2003, but a sextarian regime. So it's not only dividing people along the lines of sect and ethnicity, it's also dividing, it's also sexual division, right? And so women since 2003 had to deal with a situation of these very conservative forces trying to question the very definition, the very existence of their legal rights through this attempt to reform or abolish, more simply, the personal status code. So this is kind of happening at the legal level, which is a very important level. But on the other hand, I mean, women activists have been really at the forefront of let's say social humanitarian activism in kind of supporting people in their everyday needs, right? So and also more generally civil society activism, demanding social security, demanding I mean welfare rights, also I mean demonstrating against violence, against corruption, etc. And I have to say that there was two phenomena happening at the same time. So on the one hand, you have the kind of NGOization of women activism, because you have so much attention, especially in the aftermath of the invasion, with this neo-colonial discourse around like so-called saving Iraqi women, right? You have millions of dollars that were actually given by the US administration and other, I mean, also international organization in so-called, I mean, gender mainstreaming campaign, all of these things that actually are implemented in the region, in the Middle East, and more generally, I think in the developing world, which are very, very, I think, limited and limiting frame to actually define what women's rights are. And so, of course, this has been happening, but at the same time, there has been a lot of pragmatism, right? In a society where, I mean, very basic needs, electricity, water, right? I mean, also health, education, when this is not met, this is when you see women and women activists being at the forefront of mobilizing. And it's interesting also because I have been doing this ethnographic work among women's groups. Sorry, I've also have been very not surprised, but I've also seen the evolution in the past decade, and I've seen how actually protest movements and the generalization of the ideas and also the kind of practices of protest. These really, I think, pushed also a lot of established women activists and women's groups, let's say, outside of their comfort zone or outside of their NGOized comfort zone, and force them to actually articulate issues of women's rights in relation with other social, societal, political issues. And that's very interesting. And I would say that actually what happened since October 2019, it's even further than that. It's even further than civil society activists being very much intersectional and connecting their activism to issues of welfare, etc. I think that since October 2019, sorry, what we have seen is more ordinary women who have no established organizations, have been, you know, maybe actually October 2019 was their first protest, right? Taking up the streets and being very present, you know, physically, and this is where I think that again, it's really what the uprising also does. So when I asked many of the young protesters who took part in the October 2019 uprising, many of them would not necessarily have a gender-specific agenda or mobilize feminist issues. They would mostly say, just as also young men say, we are there, we are in Tahrir Square to honor, or in honor of the martyrs of the protests. We are here because we want to honor the memory of those who were killed in the protest. However, in what the uprising actually does, in this massive corporal presence, right, when actually bodies are massively presence in the square, it actually really challenged the order of things, and of course the patriarchal order of things. So it's interesting because it's mostly in what it does than it actually in what it says. And in that, I'm really also mobilizing notions of emancipation that are not necessarily connected to kind of a binarism of oppression versus resistance, but that are actually looking at how and when does a political action or a political mobilization really challenge the order of things. And it's much more, let's say, a Rancièrean, in the sense of Jacques Rancière, notion of emancipation than a more traditional notion that would see emancipation only as, you know, resistance versus oppression.
Thank you, Zahra. I'm told we're about to be cut off because we're coming up to our time. Thank you for talking to us today. I know you've got another book coming out, or more work coming out in the future, so we wish you the best of luck with that.
Thank you. Thank you for